And welcome, everyone. Welcome to those of you who've joined us live, and welcome to those of you who are joining us virtually. I'm Rabbi Lori Kaufman, Director of Content and Innovation here at Park Avenue Synagogue, and we're delighted to welcome you to this evening's program. It's the third in our fall series about thinking about home. What makes a home? How do we sustain our homes? And homes very broadly defined. We've talked about home at Park Avenue Synagogue, New York City is home, and tonight we'll go into our actual homes that we live in and we dwell in with our amazing panel. Thank you for joining us. We have Whitney Robinson, we have Mark Karemzadeh, and we have Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove. And I'll just do a little bit on the bios. Whitney Robinson is a design entrepreneur, style consultant, television personality, and authority in the worlds of luxury, style, interiors, and fashion. He is the founder and CEO of DW North Star, an organization which supports and advocates for individual creatives and the design industry, and is former editor-in-chief of Elle Decor, the world's leading design brand. Prior to Elle Decor, Mr. Robinson spent a decade at Hearst magazines, traveling the world, producing style and interior stories on celebrities and luminaries, including Giorgio Armani, Ralph Lauren, Julianne Moore, Bruce Willis, and Seth Meyers for Town & Country, House Beautiful, and Metropolitan Home. Mark is the editorial and communications director of the Council of Fashion Designers of America, a not-for-profit trade association whose mission is to strengthen the impact of American fashion in the global economy. Prior to CFDA, Mark was the fashion features editor at Condé Nast Publications, Women's Wear Daily, and W Magazine, where he reported on the global fashion industry and fashion weeks in New York, Milan, and Paris. And of course, we have our senior rabbi, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, joining us here as well. So thank you all for being part of our panel. So let me start with a question for you, Mark and Whitney. Before we even get to what makes a Jewish home or a home Jewish, you're both in the fashion and the decor industry. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on what we wear and where we live. Are they signifiers of us in some way? Do they represent us? How does that work?
I think they absolutely are signifiers of who we are when you think about how you dress. And I always say this to my team at the CFDA. The way you dress tells a lot about who you are, but also it empowers you to be the best version of yourself. So I think about clothes in that way of, feeling good about yourself. You want your clothes to bring out the best version of you. You want your clothes to hide your insecurities about yourself. And we all have them. And so I think fashion is just of utmost importance in terms of expressing who we are as a person. Something I've learned. It took a long time to learn that, but finally I think I got it.
Great, thank you.
No, he's adorable. Adorable answer. No, I think that, I spent my career talking about design, and that design was more than just a collection of pretty pictures on a wall or the wallpapers we chose for our house or the sofa that we sat on every day, but actually that design was intrinsic to who we are and a self-expression of who we wanted to be. And I think it's funny because I don't love talking about COVID. I don't think anyone necessarily does, but it's inevitable. I think that's going to be part of our dialogue from now for many, many years. And it's funny because fashion sort of took the top spot of how we expressed ourselves, because it's how we present ourselves to the world in outwardly fashion. But COVID forced us to sort of look within. And so whether it was the sofa that needed a little bit of repair, whether it was the fabric that was a little threadbare on the sofa, or whether it was a tradition that you wanted to have at the table or for your family to sort of sit around the Shabbat table, for instance, is relevant to tonight. I think that COVID forced us inward in a lot of really positive ways. And I think that's also a challenging thing to say, because I think people, we overwhelmingly think of COVID as being negative. But I think it also forced us to live in our dwellings and appreciate what we have in our houses, and to work on those houses as we've kind of worked on ourselves. And for the design community itself, it was a real boon. The interior design community has never been busier than it has been during COVID. which was a kind of a blessing in disguise. But yeah, I think the idea that home matters, and it matters as much as how we present ourselves to the world outside, even though people don't get to see everyone's homes. To get invited to someone's home actually means something, and now means more than anything ever before, right? Because we're scared. So having people inside your sanctuary has a greater meaning than I think it did than even 2 years ago.
That's great. And I love the language you just used, Whitney, which is sanctuary, because here we are in the sanctuary of Park Avenue Synagogue, and we think of this as a sanctuary, but you were the one, when we advertised the program, you were the one that coined the phrase that helped us, home as sanctuary, right? And sanctuary has so much meaning. Rabbi Cosgrove, what does sanctuary mean to you?
Well, given my line of work, it means everything to me. But thank you, Rabbi Kaufman, and thank you to Mara Bernstein, and thank you to everyone who made today's program possible, but especially Whitney and Mark. Thank you to the two of you. I think in all of your I just need to have some rabbinic prerogative of saying that I'm verklempt to be back here on the bima. In your bio, you didn't. I don't think we pointed out the two of you got married here on the bima, right exactly where we are, it was the very first gay wedding that happened here in Park Avenue Synagogue. So we're not going to ask you to renew your vows right now, but and I see you, if not in person in shul, then I know you're online, and loving partners and loving members of our community. I think of the Shema, and you asked Whitney and Mark the question about clothing and homes as signifiers. And the very words, the language of the Shema says that you shall place these things. I didn't think about it until I was listening to Mark and Whitney, but that you shall put these on the doorposts of your homes, these words of Torah, and that they should be on the corners of your garments, and that there must have been, even in the ancient world, some sort of intuitive sense that how we dress is a statement of our personhood. In that case, the degree to which we are literally placing the commandments on the corners of our garments, the tassels of our being, and then within our homes, that you signal to the outside world and you signal to the residents of your home that is a Jewish home. And so, look, we're standing on what I believe to be the most beautiful sanctuary in the world. But I think your question draws us to a deeper truth, which is we can consider our bodies, our clothing as sanctuaries, and so too we can consider our home as opportunities for sacred spaces.
That's great. And if we talk about signifiers, the Shema is perhaps the single best known Jewish signifier of all the prayers, of all the things we say. And so you've got the signifier that's the greatest signifier, and as you said, we wear it and we put it on the entrance to our doors. So as we start to venture into that territory and we create sanctuaries of our homes, how do you think about creating a Jewish home? How do you think about, when you started to create your Jewish home, what makes your home Jewish, or what makes you feel Jewish in your home?
It's funny, I was just thinking this morning, actually, and this is totally off the cuff, but we have this it's kind of a janky Kiddush cup. It is, do you know which one I'm talking about? It's that metal one, I think it's like Michael Aram or something. Yeah. And this Kiddush cup follows us wherever we go. And it's not even, it's not the fanciest one we have. I think we've got some fancy Tiffany silver that somebody's given us, or that we actually used for our wedding. But this one, I don't even know where, I saw it again. And it sits always we have this, these red plates, and they're always sort of stacked the same way. And wherever apartment we go, there's this Kiddush cup.
Sort of in between the plates.
Always between the plates. You always put it there. And it's this funny signifier, no matter where we go, this thing, I don't think we've even actually used it or made it into a religious object. We use other, we're far too fancy for that. So we'll find the fanciest silver in the house or whatever was your mother's or, in our families. But this one piece sort of finds us. And I think it doesn't always have to be the mezuzah on the door or how the sort of table is set, but there's these moments of Jewish life that sort of follow us, that feel beshert, and they feel, again, this is sort of a janky cup. It's not, for lack of a better word, but it's part of our Jewish life.
I love the cup.
I know. I don't know where you found it again. I saw it. I see it every day. I open the thing to get a coffee mug, and there's the Kiddush cup sitting right in front of me, like a gnome.
But I will say, we recently changed apartments. We moved to a different apartment within our building. And we'd lived in it for about 3 months or 4 months, and I'd yet to put the mezuzah on. And my niece and her husband came over a Sunday about 3 weeks ago with their young son. And I said, you know what, Oren, please, let's use this moment to put the mezuzah on the door. And that moment to me turned my home into a real home. And I didn't realize how impactful that moment of putting the mezuzah on that front door was going to be for me. Part of the reason is, and I know we haven't touched on this, but I grew up in Germany, and we always had our mezuzah on the inside of the door because we felt that we didn't want either our neighbors to know that we were Jewish, although we're pretty open about being Jewish, but there was always this fear that people would remove it. And so for me to have this freedom and the mezuzah on the outside of the door, it was a real sort of emotional moment for me, and it really transformed my home into something Jewish and where we should, how it should be.
It is a turquoise mezuzah.
It's beautiful.
It is a beautiful mezuzah that we got at the Jewish Museum.
At the Jewish Museum, yeah.
Which brings up a topic I want to circle back to maybe a little bit later, is a Jewish home can look different in different places, right? So like the fact that you put the mezuzah on the inside of your home in Germany and on the outside of your home here, there's not one definition of Jewish home. Rabbi Cosgrove, I'm curious, when you talked about the wedding you did for Mark and for Whitney. When you give advice to couples that you're marrying, then you talk to them about what they should do to build a Jewish home. Is there any kind of very specific advice you give to them?
Love each other. But specifically to the question of home, look, I think when you walk into a home, you are, I can't say it the same way that Mark and Whitney did, but you are making a statement. It is an expression of values. And I'm a big believer that there's no magic dust in this world. So if there are Jewish books in your home, that bespeaks a certain value. If there's a tablecloth out with candlesticks on Shabbat, that speaks to sacred place and sacred time. If there are, it's material culture, but it's not materialistic, right? These are statements of the things the objects we take pride in, and their place of prominence in our homes. I just. A side note, it strikes me, Whitney, two things. Number one is that it's not necessarily about the sort of market value, what we would get on eBay. I have this, I wouldn't say janky, I have this sort of near tchotchke-esque challah. It was given to me, though, it was actually given to both me and Debbie. She would be annoyed with me that I just said it. She's probably watching. She probably is annoyed. But it's a challah plate, which I have to believe is worth a couple bucks. But it was given to me by someone who I love, who passed away since Debbie and I got married. I know it's going to break someday because it's really a flimsy sort of thing. So I'm emotionally prepared for that moment that some guest in my home is going to drop it and break it. But every time it's used to pass around the challah at our Shabbos table, for me, there's sort of an emotional energy that goes into that, object, which if it's worth $20, I would be surprised. The second distinction that I would make, and I'm very curious, Whitney and Mark, how you feel about this, especially given what you just said, Mark, about the public and private in our home, right? What's when the guests walk in, and what is sort of sitting at your bedside? And I used to think to myself, I'm not a Chabadnik, but I would never stop people and ask them, have you put on tefillin yet today? But I was once of the opinion, I'm not sure if I still am, that one of the questions is sort of, what's the book at your bedside? Right? Because it's easy enough to put some fancy cha-cha book that I was just at the Met and I just saw this fancy art exhibit. But what are you actually reading? And if you're blessed with children, what do your kids see that you're reading at your bedside? And now it's all on Kindle. But that, so this public display and this private sort of space, even within our homes.
So I want to ask what you guys are reading, but in addition to the Kiddush cup, what else in your is there other things in your home that make it feel to you specifically Jewish?
Well, I was going to say something to Rabbi Cosgrove's statement. When I was in college, I sort of studied what it was like in the 18th century or 17th century in France, how people would hang paintings in their house. And there was an awful lot of rooms often. There was a salon, there was a sort of entryway, and then you got to the bedroom, and essentially what would happen is what was of taste of the day would be in the living room, because that was what you were showing people, your sort of outer. And as you of course, approached the chambers inside, that's when everything got sort of revealed. Whatever was sort of contemporary art of the day, or perhaps a little more risque, was only revealed as you were, you climbed the social ladder of family or friends of who they were. And it's interesting because home is very much, and we see this all the time. I used to see this in the magazine all the time, how we would photograph things. You get revealed as you get into people's private spaces, but home itself as well is our last private space. And in fact, when we would photograph homes often for the magazine, people wouldn't let us in. One of the hardest things was actually photographing someone's home, because it was the last piece of privacy on earth that anyone has. You can sort of telegraph who you are via social media, how you dress at work. There's ways you can sort of finesse things, so to speak, to present an image of oneself. But the home is what it is. If you don't make your bed in the morning, if you have if you're reading Danielle Steele on your bedside, you can't really, there's no way to hide that. So it's this revelatory thing, and in fact, they're our most intimate spaces, and they reveal as much as anything about ourselves. But anyway, that's my thought about what Rabbi Cosgrove said. I don't know, what's our most Jewish object at home?
Well, you mentioned the Kiddush cup.
Kiddush cup, but also the Hanukkah.
We have
probably.
2 Hanukkahs.
We have 3.
We have 3. We have a
Well, the first one we have is the beautiful gold one.
The beautiful gold one, yeah. That sits by the window at all times.
That's right.
And we have a very traditional one, and then we have a limited edition Menorchi,
yes.
which was the year that
turkey,
Hanukkah and Thanksgiving happened at the same time.
Kismet.
Thanksgiving. It was Thanksgiving.
It was Thanksgiving.
Yes. Thanksgiving.
That Menorchi is very special. Speaking of tchotchke.
Well, and our ketubah is very prominently placed as you walk into the apartment.
Oh, nice. So I was going to ask about, so it's part of it's the objects, and part of it's, as you were both saying, where they are, right? Is the Kiddush, for some people, the Kiddush cup and the candlesticks might be in the closet, so you can walk into a home that's very Jewish but not see anything. But then I love what you explained, Whitney, how you, as you go in more and more inside, interior, right? So, but your ketubah is right at the entrance. That's really beautiful.
Because I don't let everyone in our bedroom, FYI. I don't know about you guys. But I think it's about intimacy. New York is, not everyone has the biggest apartments, and so you end up putting your coats in the bedroom, or you end up, but often, I'm a little more traditionalist about that. But in terms of our ketubah, what's interesting is we had a friend of ours who was a very prominent LA-based Jewish artist, an artist who is Jewish. His last name is Israel. And he created something that is in itself such a beautiful piece of contemporary art that also happens to be the most sacred document of our lives. And so that is now the first thing you see when you come into the apartment. It's the first piece of art that's sort of prominently displayed. And it's interesting for me is that people look at it and at first they see Alex's work because that's what the background is. It's a sort of it's become quite a popular trope in his oeuvre. And then when you get closer, you're like, oh wait, that's your ketubah. And I like playing off of that because I think that it's, I don't know, it's somehow it feels very modern to me that way.
Which is also lovely because it signifies a Jewish home and not the way some people might have identified a Jewish home, 50, 100 years ago, right? Because it was, it was a heterogeneous marriage, but you have a Jewish home that you're signifying that not every Jewish home looks the same, right? And so you're creating a Jewish home in your own way.
Well, I like the idea of it, and perhaps this is where we have such a great push and pull, but also rather than seeing a piece of embroidered lace or something that feels very of a certain time, this one feels very now, and I think it also it contemporizes Judaism for us in our relationship in our home in a very significant way. So it seems actually pretty cool, and I want people to think that.
Right, so far we have home as, there's objects that signify home, both the outside, the mezuzah, and the inside. What you're reading, the books signify a Jewish home, and then the people also, like who's in the home, right, is a signifier. What else, it's an open question for all you guys, what else signifies a Jewish home?
Food.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not that hungry.
But these are all vehicles for identity, right? I mean, if you think about the recipes that we've handed, down, the tablecloths that are passed down from one generation to generation, I mean, they're vessels. They're vessels for identity. The smells, the tastes, these are the sort of the Proustian things that bring out identity.
You go.
Well, and I would say, in terms of the Jewish identity, I think that even in the diaspora, all of our foods that we've taken from the cultures that we've lived in have some sort of Jewish inflection. And so, for instance, the Persian, my father was from Iran, and on Shabbat there is sort of like a chickpea meatball that they have, and it's sort of an Iranian version of a matzah ball in a way. And so,
Dolma.
no, it's a gondi.
Gondis. God.
And so that is something very typical that Persian Jews eat on Friday night, and it sort of must all go back to the Levant and to sort of our origins in Judea, that somehow these foods are so similar and yet they've been sort of changed through the years in exile that we've had.
But this is what's so cool, actually. So through Mark, so I'm very much an Ashkenazi Jew, raised sort of in between the tri-state area, and Mark being so international, German, Persian, but also we spend a lot of our time abroad. We travel quite a bit. And whether we're in Shanghai, or whether we're in Venice, or whether we are in
Rome.
Rome.
Obviously the artichokes in Rome.
But also, even beyond food, we spend a lot of time discovering the sort of Jewish diaspora, especially a Mizrahi or Sephardic diaspora. And what's amazing is those traditions are all the same. I mean, I think about whether it's a Torah or whether it's any kind of Jewish symbol, whether we see it at the synagogue in Rome or whether we see the Jews who emigrated to Shanghai post-war or pre-war, they're universal and they bring us together in a really powerful way, and also for thousands of years. I think we talked about this on the last time we spoke.
Right.
That I often think of my Jewish history as like Brighton Beach memoirs to the present. It's like 1950s. Like Judaism starts in 1950 and ends right now. And then when I'm with Mark, it's like, no, it's thousands of years old, and there are traditions passed down for thousands of years. And as we travel and we see these things, or through your family, it's a passed down tablecloth, but also for long.
This interesting question of, I mean, Whitney, you sort of have this very Ashkenormative tri-state experience. Mark, you have this very international, Persian inflections, German inflections, and this question of like, what is Jewish, right? Because I walk through this world thinking, oh, well, everyone kind of grew up in a nice Ashkenazi Jewish home, just like me, but that's wrong. And not everyone grew up with gefilte fish and, matzo ball soup and all that. So, I mean, it's actually interesting. I'm teaching a class on Tuesday mornings on cultures of the Jews, the multiplicity and the way that Jewish culture sort of adapts and to its non-Jewish environment, and so too Judaism assimilates in, right? Whether it's music, whether it's recipes, whether it's design, whether it's dress, this sort of very variated understanding of what Judaism is not one thing. It's actually contextually bound, which I guess Mark kind of speaks to your experience.
Right.
Mark, do you want to share a little bit of your experience? Because we're sort of alluding to it, but some people are in the know and some people are not in the know. So
I was born in Hamburg, Germany, and I grew up there. I was there until I was 18 years old when I came to college in America. My mother was born in Lithuania, but they made their way westward, and she was raised in northern Germany. She was born into the war, and nobody else in my family survived except for my grandmother, and so she always had this draw towards Judaism, and she moved to Hamburg, which was the biggest town near where she grew up, and had a Jewish community. Sounds, there were less Jews than there was in a building on the Upper East Side in Hamburg. So when she worked at the JCC, which again, I always say this, was not, a big building with a swimming pool and tennis courts and lessons. It was really an office of 5 people. She met my dad, who was an Iranian immigrant he immigrated in the 1950s, and they married in the 60s. And it was this fusion of an Ashkenazi and a Mizrahi kind of heritage that I grew up in. In terms of my mother, and she'll probably be better talking about this herself, and I know she's watching tonight, she adapted to a lot of the Middle Eastern cultures in terms of she learned the language, she learned to make the food, but we will have Persian food for Shabbat dinner, but without exception, we start with gefilte fish. And that sort of should really be the title of my book, in a way. It's like gefilte fish and, Persian stew. And tahdig, exactly. And so we grew up in this mixed environment, and it worked. I think it was just really enriching. I had a lot of family on my dad's side, and have a lot of family. They're mostly in Great Neck now, and in Israel. Sadly, I had no family on my mom's side, except for my grandmother. And so I never really had that full experience on that side, but my story is not unique. It's common to most European Jews. But I loved all of it.
But fast forward to New York, though.
Fast forward to New York.
Oh, that's mine.
That's your cue.
Well, I was going to say, what's amazing is to be able to witness for the last 15 years, when you don't sort of realize it at first, because Bibi, as we call her, Miriam Karamzada, is she's a fortress. She's a force to be sort of reckoned with. And I'm not going to give her age, but she's a very young, however old she is. But she is a real survivor. And it's interesting also, I keep going back to this, I don't know why I'm so COVID sort of focused today. I've had COVID tests all day today. But she, COVID is something for her, but really nothing, right? Because she's really survived everything that there is to survive. And witnessing this pandemic sort of through her eyes is so, it's so incredible, because, she sees things in a in a much bigger and longer term perspective. But also what's interesting about witnessing her is that it's never a big deal, right? I don't know if, her book will be titled, "That Don't Impress Me Much." But the truth is that nothing really sort of phases her. And I think that's also a testament to her experience and also what she's witnessed, both positive and sort of quite tragically. We know what she's witnessed quite tragically. On the positive side, she has about 20 grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
She has 4 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren.
9 great-grandchildren, 4, all in Great Neck, which is such a mitzvah in itself. But what's amazing is to hear other people talk about her in the community. Because for us, she's just Bibi. So her making this food, she's just mom. So for her now she's mom, out there.
Well, she's been featured in articles,
the
right?
forward,
there have been articles written about
with her for sure. No, she's become quite famous on Instagram and is a real ham for the camera. But I think that what's incredible is to see other people talk about her because her story is so unique. And I think that was a story of a lot of other Jews, but actually there's something very specific and unique about her experience that is, that I think, as you say, is also about the multiplicity of Jewish identity, that could also exist. Because that's so, on paper, it's just such an improbable story, but it actually exists and it thrives in a really beautiful way and multiplies itself in the next generations.
And the way you've told me a little bit about her before is what's beautiful is it's not just about the food, but it's Shabbat dinner, right? So the other thing that happens in Jewish homes is not just that we eat, and we do love our food, but we eat ritualistically. We have Shabbat dinners, we have holiday dinners, and I think that those very much, from what I've heard, your mother's Shabbat dinners are sort of amazing and infamous. Is that true?
Well, I'll say that growing up, and maybe this is something that's very common, is we were always told, as you grow up, you can go out any night of the week, but Friday night, you have to be at home. Because that's the one night that as a family, we're all going to be at the table, and that's the one night we're going to spend together and just connect. And that was really important to me. And even as I was growing older and moving out and living by myself, I still want to be with my family on Shabbat. And hopefully one day we'll, give that generation, that tradition to the next generation.
It will be for 50 years. It's never going to happen. It's a non-negotiable. That's the thing. It's a non-negotiable. It's not even, it's so interesting. In my family, it was negotiable. Some Shabbat dinners, Friday night Shabbat, totally understood. But sometimes they went out, or sometimes it wasn't always steady. This is a non-negotiable, and it's gospel in a way. And I think
is that the strongest signifier of all, which is the allocation of time.
Sure.
Meaning more than how we dress, more than we don't need to create a hierarchy.
We put our focus on.
If more than an object in our home, it's the allocation of our time.
Well, that's the
spend
most
time
important
together.
thing. Well, that's what we've also learned during this entire pandemic, right? Is what we actually focus our hours on. What is actually important to us? Is it family? Was it work? Do we want to go in the office, out of the office? What does family time mean to us? What does sacred time mean to us? What does alone time mean to us? So yes, where we allocate our time is the most important thing. It's all we really have, and that's not in any kind of morbid sense. And I think that throughout the pandemic, Shabbat was still, even via Zoom or the holidays, still the most important phone call or moment spent or signifier in mom's life and certainly your family's life.
Lockdown, we were all apart, we were all in separate places, and what we did was we would do a Zoom, not a Zoom, is it a FaceTime? Whatever it was, we would do it, and we would say the bracha together with both our moms, and then we would all sort of eat our piece of challah and have the wine and eat the piece of challah together. That was really important.
And just to the point of gefilte fish before, gefilte fish wasn't negotiable when I was growing up because nobody liked it. That was sort of also the point, right? Is that gefilte fish was not so great. His mother
You
makes
never
the,
had my mother's.
well, his mother makes the best gefilte fish.
Yeah,
Maybe my
no,
grandmother made
no,
a good
but
one.
there's gefilte fish out of the glass, and then there's gefilte fish that
Well, it was like
one
a
makes.
But I'm not. But here we go in hierarchy. I think that the idea of the Manischewitz gefilte fish was also the running joke of, you know, who wants to eat that thing that is, if anyone works for Manischewitz or is sponsored by them, but nobody wanted to eat that brown mush out of a jar. Meanwhile, when I started eating gefilte fish with your mom 15 years ago, which is I'm sure like your mom's or grandmother's, it's the best in the world. But that was, I didn't realize it was a food group.
And I think, although what's interesting is though it's time, but it's also when you guys said you say the bracha. So there's a beautiful piece in the Talmud that talks about when the sanctuary was destroyed. So it used to be that the temple was how we were Jews a couple of thousand years ago, and that's how we worshipped God. And then there was this discussion with the rabbis. Oh no, what happens when the sanctuary is destroyed? Like what do we do? And the rabbis say that the table became the new sanctuary, actually, speaking of sanctuary. That the kitchen table, that the table at home, that our meals are actually create holiness and holy spaces. So we say the blessings, like we're supposed to say blessings before and after we eat. You know, there's something about the gratitude piece of it, right? And so we acknowledge God and that there's something greater than us. So it's the blessings, but it's also the blessing of who we spend time with, right? And what happens there. So the food is a gathering vehicle, but it's a way for us to spend sacred time together in these places that are sacred. Does that make sense?
No, totally agree.
Yeah.
Rabbi?
I have a question, and this is all sort of unscripted, but I just kind of want to ask, are there assumptions about what a Jewish home looks like? Sort of a heteronormative, like husband, wife, you know, I mean, at Park Avenue, I'd like to think it's as inclusive as possible. But there are different kinds of Jewish families. There are different kinds of, there are single moms, there are divorcees, there are widows, there are gay couples, there are straight, there are all sorts of different ways to define Jewish home. And I also, if I may, I'd love to also have you, Rabbi Kaufman, not just as a questioner, but also as a participant in this. But I want to throw that out to everyone. If they're like, what do we need to, like, what's a baggage we're carrying as far as what defines a Jewish home that might be good to bring to the fore in the conversation?
It's got to be fabulous. I'm just kidding. No. What does a Jewish home look like? I don't know. It's funny. I always think about Mark has this sort of sense of the Upper West Side, and had had a friend, and Jacob didn't live on the West Side. His mom was on the East Side.
He grew up on the West Side.
He grew up on the West Side, and his mom was a famous director who directed and wrote movies like When Harry Met Sally and sort of famous movies. Anyway, and they had this sort of definition of like what he thought. Will you say what you thought Nora's house was like on the Upper West Side?
When I was growing up, I mean, I think that there was this idea of like the intellectual Upper West Side that was sort of so Jewish in spirit, and even if it wasn't necessarily religious, I had this idea of like this walking down, you know, Columbus Avenue, West End Avenue, and hearing like a Jewish kid play the piano out of the window. And maybe it's a Woody Allen thing, and that's sort of this idea of the Jewish Upper West Side that I had, that I grew up with.
Charades at Rosh Hashanah.
Oh yeah, playing charades at Thanksgiving, and sort of this intellectual Jewish life that I associated the Upper West Side with in ways that you know was so unique to New York.
It's a really good question. I mean, it's something to think about. I think that for us, I think that our Jewish friends, heteronormative, our gay Jewish friends, a lot of people are having families now. Our friend Paul Arnold, you know, a very good friend. A lot of people are having, David Kaufman, a lot of good friends are having babies in gay relationships. And I think that there's something about our friends, as I think about this in real time, gay, straight, or otherwise, you know, it's the importance of family again. And I think there's a through line of that. And I'm not saying that every gay Jewish friend we have has a baby, or every straight family we have is traditional heteronormative, but there is something about continuity and family and tradition that is still very important to them. I mean, we talked about this with our friend, I don't know if David Kaufman's watching, but he is a single gay dad now who's raising 2 twins, and Shabbat and travels to Israel with his family are very important. He'll be there over the holidays. And so, I think that's something that I don't know, that's maybe intrinsic. I hope it is, at least.
And I don't think you're right, it's not about objects and art and all of that, which is a beautiful thing to have and a blessing, but it's really about the sort of Hamisha feeling. Mm-hmm. The feeling that you walk into someone's home and you're welcomed in that home. It's this idea of, I'll never forget that when growing up, maybe I was a teenager, there were not enough Jews in Germany, so we had friends all over Germany, and I remember my dad coming home one Friday night from shul, and he brought parents of a friend of mine that he randomly met. They were just happened to be in town, and he brought them home for Shabbat dinner. And this was before cell phones, this was before anything. So we just ended up having them over for Shabbat dinner, and then ended up spending the whole weekend with them. So there's something about sort of that Hamisha feeling.
And that's a big part of your experience, and I think it's really interesting. I watched a play called Leopoldstadt, which is by Tom Stoppard. It's playing on the West End. It's about a family in Vienna through the war that starts in the 20s, an intellectual family. And we think about like Adele Bloch-Bauer, and we think about the Neue Gallery and the Lauder family, and we think about a lot of the people we've been around, and I think that that's where perhaps the intellectual experience. I don't know why you're laughing.
I'm about to say something, you're going to kill me.
What?
On the other end of the spectrum,
what's that?
You have the Nanny's family.
Oh, he watches The Nanny with Fran Drescher. If everyone remembers that family.
Cliche Queen's family.
That's right.
With plastic covered sofas. Mm-hmm. And you think it's kind of a stereotype.
Listen, people ask why we live in Manhattan all the time, and I said, listen, we started in Queens, we finally got over the river, and we did not look back after that. And I have no judgment against that, of course, but we're not going back. I'm not going back to Brooklyn, right? It took us a long time to get over to this part of the island, and we are not swimming back.
But I think you asked an important question. So some people submitted some questions online before the event, and someone submitted a question, how do I make a home feel Jewish when I live alone, right? And there's these I think the movies can be like really terrible in some ways. Like I think about Fiddler on the Roof, and it's like the perfect family, I mean, except for the pogroms, but the perfect family with lighting the Shabbat, everybody's well dressed and well behaved, and it's the mother and the father and then the kids. And that's just not the reality. I remember when my kids were younger and I was trying to do Shabbat dinner, and I didn't always do Shabbat dinner. I was pretty secular for a fairly long point in my life, and then I started to gradually do more Jewish stuff. And my kids were like totally melting down, and I'm like, how come everybody else can manage to do this in their perfect Jewish home? But that's like, it's not like that. So I think it's really important to lift up the fact that, that you guys have a Jewish home, and that you have a friend who's a single dad raising kids, and Jewish homes come in all shapes and sizes, and that there's not one normative, perfect thing. Like I was the one who did Kiddush in my home. It was traditionally, you would think that like when I was married, it would be like the man does Kiddush and the woman lights the candles. But that's not necessarily the way it is anymore. And I think it's what we bring to it. And I think it's important to think that that it's important to keep the tradition, but that we also need to evolve and change and own it and make it real and make it ours.
I love the one thing, and sort of you mentioned this, is sort of this idea of, if you are single or if you live in an untraditional home, you have some objects that were passed on, this lador vador, this object that was passed on to you by someone you love, whether it's a friend, whether it's a parent, whether it's, and you bring that Kiddush cup, or that, that cloth that you put over the challah that belonged to your grandparent or something, and that brings a sort of sense of soul into your home and meaning.
I mean, is it just me, or does every Jewish family have more photographs of each other than any other phrase
everywhere?
Your mother has a sort of break front, or whatever you call it when you come in. There are more frames on this table. That the fact that they all can stand consecutively without completely falling over like a domino.
One, they'll all go.
Gone. I've never, in the age of digital, I've never seen more photographs on the wall.
Different sort of surfaces have like groupings of photos.
Hundreds of every aspect of every part of the life. And I'll tell you, everyone who walks into that house, it tells the story of that Jewish experience. And I think that maybe it's just your family, but my mother has the same thing. My grandparents certainly had they in their apartment in Palm Beach, they just sort of tack it to the wall in a much less sort of elegant way than what's at your mom's. And I think we've actually continued that tradition. From our first day we met to our wedding day. So there's a whole experience there through photography.
Right, so we keep, the list keeps growing, right? And so, and photography is also, it's bringing the people, in a way, it's bringing the people into your home even when they're not there. It's the family and others that are important to you.
Oh, there's a comfort in that, I think.
Right. And the tradition of the stuff that was handed down, the challah cover and the,
Yeah, we forget that these days because everything's on our phones. So we take out our phones and we scroll and we whatever, but actually that sort of imprinted memory, I think, is really vital. And I wouldn't have a home without an actual physical photograph in it, because it's the first thing we see, and it's certainly the thing that touches the most.
So I do want to go back to that question, Rabbi Cosgrove. For the person who lives alone, is there something that you would suggest that they do to enhance the Jewish in their home?
If I turn the mirror back to me as rabbi, I think we can be doing a much better job as a synagogue. I'm very aware, much as I'm proud of the community and the community we've built and are in the, I think that when I've had quiet conversations with people who are single parents, I think there are unspoken sort of signals of, even just that self-consciousness that when people are sitting together in synagogue with their kids, or what a membership form says, with a drop-down menu, are there unspoken assumptions of what constitutes a Jewish family, and that someone, not with any ill will or malice, but that someone would feel, I don't fit into this community. I think that we have to be super intentional as a synagogue to make sure that the starting and end point for everything we do as a synagogue is that every human being is created in the image of God. And for me, it kind of goes, the primary sanctuary is that of our bodies. And for someone to ever feel less than in their own skin is unforgivable and unconscionable of me as a rabbi, to feel that someone might feel that way about anything. And so I think that are there practical steps that if someone's watching this tonight, I would say that there is a gesture of community, that no one should feel excluded from the community, whether that's taking class, coming to shul, participating in what I hope is a vibrant synagogue life, getting involved, being on committees, right? Those are open expressions of Jewish life that are open to everyone, no matter who you are and your marital status and whether you have children or not. And so that's a starting place, but it's a conversation I'm totally committed to having.
And another question that came in, and then I'll open it up if you guys have any questions here, but was about, and Mark, you brought this up about how your dad brought home guests, about, And Whitney, you talked about how our spaces are private, and a lot of people, not everyone's comfortable bringing people into their home. But one of the Jewish traditions is hospitality, right? Hachnasat orchim, we should welcome people in. So is there a way that we could be more, like, should we open our homes up more? Is there a way that we would be more open, more welcoming? What does a Jewish home look like in terms of welcoming guests?
I think there's an elastic definition of that, and that's that, we looked at like Shabbos Project, and there's a bunch of other kind of cool initiatives from young, kind of millennial, conservative, otherwise Jewish people who are trying to take Shabbat to the streets, so to speak, because listen, the truth in New York, as I've said, and this is something I faced a long time as a design editor, is not everyone lives in a 5,000 square foot, apartment, with a view of Central Park, right? That is not the going concern, right, or rate in New York. And so having someone, having 20 people over in a tiny apartment isn't always necessarily the most practical thing in the entire world. But I think the idea of, in New York, restaurants often form our living rooms, right? It's how people entertain, because it's just, again, a space is at a premium. But I think the idea that if you can't entertain at home or you don't have the space, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. There are other places to be able to do it and to use, whether it's hosting a Shabbat in Central Park in the summer or whatever it may be. I think there's ways to think about it where it doesn't have to be so dogmatic. And I think that's what Rabbi Cosgrove was also getting at as well, that the idea of that, I think people tend to think that any kind of religiousness is dogma, but there's actually, it's living and breathing and modern and contemporary, and so too should the traditions be, I guess.
Right. Great. Just wanted to offer questions from any of you guys, if you have questions for. We've got lots more to talk about, but I wanted to make sure, since I was bringing in questions from people online, I just wanted to make sure that people here had a chance. Hold on, Mara's got a microphone now.
Thanks. I worked in magazines for 15 years, so I'm aware of the shelter magazines where all the beautiful homes that you describe. But in this pandemic, what have you seen them do to really cater to how people are at home much, much more, and how they're living their lives in this time?
That's such a good question. The easy answer is that shelter magazines were always about fantasy. And so they were always about a way, not how we necessarily live. This is sort of the deep, dark secret of magazines, which have now been sort of, this is a much longer conversation, but it was not about how actually people live, but how we wanted to live. It was kind of a better version of ourselves. Anytime we went to photograph a house, we cleaned up beforehand. No one's closet looks that perfect, or a kitchen looks that good, or a sink is that empty. So, I mean, that's sort of the pulling the curtain back a little bit. But I think that they've gotten much realer, to tell you the truth. And I think that there's less of that than there was before, and less of that sort of dreamscape of how people ought to live and actually how people really live. And there's a freedom in that, and I think there's a reality in that that's actually quite beautiful, and celebrating, who we actually are instead of who we think we ought to be. And I can't say that was necessarily what I prescribed to for many years. I grew up in a very different, as you imagined, place where, again, it was about fantasy, but I think this is really about, the reality of how tough life has been, and how we can, create our homes again, though, in a positive way as our sanctuaries. I think of a friend, not to go too long-winded about this, but a friend of mine has two gorgeous kids, Jamie Rosen, and she has created a sort of I don't know if I would call it a closet or a phone booth, but it's where she goes to sort of escape and have her phone calls. It's definitely a closet, I think. But we may never in the magazine business have ever talked about anything like that before. This is literally like a windowless closet she goes in that she's decorated, so it's her Zoom background. But it's the only place in the house where she can actually make phone calls and be productive, and it's her I don't know if it's about 10 square feet or 25 square feet, but it's where she goes. And I think we all ended up figuring out what space that was for us during this time, how to carve out our own space within our houses. So I think hopefully that the magazines reflect that.
Mark, do you think that's true of fashion too? Have the same trends of, it's like fashion magazines always struck me as aspirational, and have they become more real?
I think that they have become more real. I think that there's just so much that we see on social media, a lot of it real, some of it, most of it not probably, but I think that they've adapted to that aesthetic. I think the pandemic has been really interesting because we've had to start learning how to dress from the waist up and then not really care about what we have on the lawn.
You have to wear pants.
You have to wear pants, correct. But what we wore up here was much more important than what was what done there.
Top sales outsold bottom sales by 2 to 1.
And so I think it was an interesting time. I think going back to the first question that we had about sort of how fashion makes you feel is, I remember after about 3 months of just wearing sneakers, I remember putting on a real pair of shoes and it felt so good. And I think that there is that sort of, fashion has that impact. To feel dressed up is to feel good.
To be back in the world in a certain kind of way, right? Right. So it's nice sometimes it's nice to retreat sometimes, but it's also nice to have the ability to be back in the world.
Right. Take off your sweats.
Right. Right. Rabbi Cosgrove, yeah.
No,
Rabbi Cosgrove never put on sweats during the pandemic, to be clear.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. So I want to sort of close thank you so much for this conversation. It's really wonderful, and I really have appreciated all of your insights. And when we think about homes, what you talked about as places, that the home can be a lot of different things to us, right? It can be family, it can be places of comfort, it can be places of security. And they're places that represent our values and our ethics. And a lot of times those of us who have children, we want, as you said, Rabbi Cosgrove, what are your kids watching you read, right? What are your kids watching you do on Friday night? Like your mother's Shabbat, it was non-negotiable, it had such an impact on you. So a lot of times our homes are places where we want to think about transmitting those values, and they place us in something that is, it's part of our story. It's part of our bigger story, the story of our past, and hopefully the story of our future. So with this week's Torah portion, we have the death of Jacob, and we see this, I think, in 2 different ways. One is he blesses his son Joseph and Joseph's sons, his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and it's the blessing that we use on Friday nights, but he does it invoking not just himself, but his father and his grandfather, right? So he says, I'm here, and here's a blessing for you, but the blessing puts you in the arc of history, and you will have multitudes that come after you. And so we are here 2,000 or however many thousands of years later, still talking about these Shabbat dinners and the things that make a home Jewish and make us Jewish. And then at the end of the Torah portion, he asks his son actually to take him home. And he wants to be buried back in Canaan, back where his father was buried, back where his father and mother, his grandparents were buried as well. And so I hate to close on the Wizard of Oz, but there's, when I think about there's no place like home, in his final moments, what he felt would give him the most peace was actually to be back home. So the home is so resonant and so powerful for us all in so many ways. And so I just thank you for sharing the ways that you have brought to us the ways that we can think about home and making Jewish homes and continuing to evolve the way we think about Jewish homes. So thank you for all you've shared with us.
Thank you. Talk about a Throwback Thursday on that one. It's amazing. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.